Hello and welcome to Story Time for Saturday, March 8th, 2025. Well, for some of us, we're lucky to be in 2025. I feel lucky to be in 2025. I'm sorry that we are in the current political situation that we're in, but I actually have something to share with you, and I'm not going to try and duplicate the entire talk, but you may actually know, and you may actually dislike David Brooks from the New York Times, who recently gave a speech to a bunch of Brits for the Society for Responsible Citizenship, something like that. And he's a conservative, but he is, and he said, I got the job as a conservative columnist at the New York Times, which is like being a rabbi in Mecca, right? So, he's very funny. He's got a great attitude, um, and he, we don't necessarily like the fact that he did not like the social justice movement, but he also dislikes the MAGA movement. But what he says in this speech, which I found really interesting, is that he understands the impetus for both movements is the same, which is that of community. And according to him, he's a smart guy. He's a thinker. He says, we're moving from the age of the individual into more of an age of community. If you want to listen to it, and I highly recommend it because it's something, he's a conservative columnist, and I don't agree with everything that he says, but I agree with a lot of what he says. And I think that not only are we entering an age of community, but I think we need to also remember that we're in an age of subtlety. And just because someone has some views that you don't like doesn't mean that you have that they must be rejected outright because they don't share some views. If they do share some views, that's good. I posted it in the chat, so you can just copy it from the chat and then listen to it after story time. Don't listen to it now because we've got some poetry to get through. I want to start out our ekphrastic scene with Wisława Szymborska, who is the incredible Polish poet who won the Nobel Peace Prize in poetry, and who, let's see, there she is. 1996 is when she won the Nobel Peace Prize. She was born in 1923, 1 year after my father. And were she to be alive this year, she'd be 102. She died at age 88 in 2012. And she wrote a poem called Some Like Poetry, in which she said that perhaps 2 in 1,000 people like poetry, yet she is internationally known for her books of poetry and won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so, of course, she's written some ekphrastic poetry. And if you'll remember from last time, ekphrastic poetry is poetry that is written about art. And there's a little painting about 8 by 9 inches in the Dahlem Museum in Berlin that's by Peter Bruegel, the Elder. And it's just 2 monkeys sitting in a little arched window looking out into the world. And you do have to remember that Wisława Szymborska published in Polish. And so every translation of this is going to be a little bit different. But here's one that has been translated from the Polish by Magnus Krycki. I keep dreaming of my graduation exam. In a window sit two chained monkeys. Beyond the window floats the sky, and the sea splashes. I am taking an exam on the history of mankind. I stammer and flounder. One monkey, eyes fixed upon me, listens ironically. The other seems to be dozing. And when silence follows a question, he prompts me with a soft jingling of the chain. So it is so radically different, these translations, that in another translation I've read of this, instead of it says, beyond the window floats the sky and the sea splashes, it says, the sea takes its bath, which I think is a much more interesting translation of that. And so on and so forth. Like, many things are different. But here's a poem written actually in English, so we don't have to have a translation. And this one is another painting by Bruegel, which has apparently stimulated a lot of ekphrastic poetry. You know, William Carlos Williams lived from 1883 to 1963. And his poem, if you've ever seen this painting, this is a really impassioned and beautiful description of the painting. According to Bruegel, when Icarus fell, it was spring. A farmer was plowing his field. The whole pageantry of the year was awake, tingling near the edge of the sea, concerned with itself, sweating in the sun that melted the wing's wax. Unsignificantly off the coast, there was a splash, quite unnoticed. This was Icarus drowning. That, I don't know why that poem just gives me chills, but it does. It's like, and the painting is absolutely incredible, because it's like, it's called The Fall of Icarus, but Icarus is this tiny little piece of a much larger world. Now, I don't know if you remember this, but in the either the late 90s or the early 2000s, Munch's Scream was stolen from the museum. And everyone will recognize or remember what the Scream is. There's been copycat art and even Scream T-shirts made. But here's an ekphrastic poem by Monica Yoon called "Stealing the Scream." It was hardly a high-tech operation, stealing the Scream. That we know for certain. And what was left behind? A store-bought ladder, a broken window, and 51 seconds of videotape. Abstract as an overture. And the rest? We don't know. But we can envision moonlight coming in through the broken window, casting a bright shape over everything. The paintings, the floor tiles, the velvet ropes, a single sharp-edged pattern. The figure's fixed hysteria rendered suddenly ironic by the fact of something happening, houses clapping 1,000 shingle hands to shocked cheeks along the road from Oslo to Asgardstrand. The guards rushing in, too late, greeted only by the gap-toothed smirk of the museum walls, and dangling from the picture wire like a baited hook, a postcard. Thanks for the poor security. The policemen, lost as tourists, stand whispering in the galleries. But what does it all mean? Someone has the answers. Someone who, grasping the frame, saw his sun-red face reflected in that familiar boiling sky. An ekphrastic poem by Monica Yoon called Stealing the Scream, which is not necessarily a description of the painting, but a description of the theft of the painting. I think it still counts. In 1972, an artist named Anne Truitt created basically a 15-foot tall, bright red rectangle, which was just simply, here's a black and white picture of it. Hardly does it justice because it is monolithic in scale. Victoria Chang wrote a poem, and this place that I originally got this poem from has the line breaks correct, but with one important difference. When this poem was first published, it was written and line justified on the left and the right. So the poem itself reflected the shape of the actual piece of art, which is not evident in the flush left, ragged right version that I'm reading to you right now. But just try to imagine that as I'm reading this, that the lines are forming this vertical column, very much like the column of the piece of art itself. It's called Midday, which is the name both of the poem and of the art piece. A square table put out just for me in Emily Dickinson's bedroom. My back to her dead mother in the other room, my front to her bed. Lace curtains remind me of women before me. She lived until 55. Anne Truitt until 83. I am 52. Prowling at the edge of revelation. How Truitt painted the bright red horizontally, then vertically to smooth out the eyes, then sanded down the tears that came through. How she wanted what was left to be even, burnished alive. I imagine her head on the bed, tilted past death, her dashes in my direction. Who gets to speak? Who gets to brush? Whose tendons of mind are visible? Who gets to scratch? Who gets to sand? Who gets to spend our lives inside thinking, gnashing our lives into 10-foot tall rectangular thoughts? I run my hands through my hair, hoping to leave behind a black strand, an unquestionable strand. Ineligible split end. How strange to be in this room demanding awe. To sit down and write a poem where I could never have been. On the other side of the country, at the same time, Chinatowns were burned down. What am I to do with all these seams? The world that keeps growing back, the women who are adjuncts to the world that is unfaithful. What if I am no longer in awe of the stiff light? Expiring rims of time, smoothing only itself. I had an hour, and now my time is up. She's gone, and she's gone. Still, I am here, pressed between her and hurt, between the cross-talking ghosts, taking what they'll give. Her dead mother behind me, my dead mother beyond me, all the beheaded love mixing at noon in red. After others die, where do we put our sadness? After we die, where does our sadness go? So I promised in my notice that I would read you some words that inspired paintings. And I guess if you write a poem about a piece of art, it's called an ekphrastic poem. But if you make a piece of art about a poem or a book or a piece of literature, it's just called art. So there is a famous painting which you may have seen. Many people have seen this. It's called Ophelia, and it's the beautiful woman kind of floating toward her death. It's by John Everett Millais. And it's actually from Shakespeare's Hamlet. It's not technically a poem, but it could be construed as such. And this painting is particular because Millet's sitter, Elizabeth Siddall, modeled for the painter in a bathtub for hours, heated in a space heated just by an oil lamp, not an oil heater, but an oil lamp. As a consequence, she caught a very severe cold, and her father demanded that Millet pay him 50 pounds, which was a great deal of money in those days for her medical expenses. And there's a myth, of course, that she died when posing for this picture, but the evidence is not there for that. And here are the few lines in the poem where Ophelia talks about the flowers that Millet puts in his image, because if you remember, the image is her floating downstream, kind of dead in the water, and surrounded by flowers. There's rosemary, that's for remembrance. Pray you, love, remember. And there is pansies, that's for thoughts. There's fennel for you, and columbines. There's rue for you, and here's some for me. We may call it herb of grace a Sundays. You may wear your rue with a difference. There's a daisy. I would give you some violets. And of course, from the same, mid 19th century era, there is John William Waterhouse's Lady of Shalott. And it is, the painting is inspired by a poem of the same name by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Tennyson was not a 13th century poet, but he, I guess, retold the story of a 13th century lyrical ballad, which tells the story of Elaine of Astolat, or Astrolae. And she was a young noblewoman stranded in a tower up the river from Camelot. And it's inspired by medieval sources, Arthurian subject matter. She's trapped in that tower and forbidden from looking out on the world, and instead looks through a mirror at the world. But after seeing Lancelot through the mirror, she looks out of her window and becomes the victim of a curse. She then finds a boat and floats down a river to Camelot, where she unfortunately dies before arriving. And this is the section that describes that beautiful poem. And you can just, if you're curious what it looks like, look up John William Waterhouse's Lady of Shalott, sometimes called the Mad Woman of Shalott. A long-drawn carol, mournful, holy, she chanted loudly, chanted lowly, till her eyes were darkened wholly, and her smooth face sharpened slowly, turned to towered Camelot, for ere she reached upon the tide the first house by the waterside, singing in her song, she died, the Lady of Shalott. So I promised also that we would read a little bit of the description of the shield of Achilles. Now, normally I don't read ancient Greek Homerian poetry here on Storytime, but it's an ekphrastic piece because there's this beautifully wrought and crafted shield which belongs to Achilles and was forged by Hephaestus, the forge of the smith of the gods, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm gonna read just the part of him forming the immense shield because there's several paragraphs that lead us up to this point. And this is Hephaestus in his forge. Then first he formed the immense and solid shield. Rich, various artifice emblazed the field. Its utmost verge a threefold circle bound. A silver chain suspends the massy round. 5 ample plates the broad expanse compose, and godlike labors on the surface rose. There shone the image of the master mind. There earth, there heaven, there oceans he designed. The unwearied sun, the moon completely round, the starry lights at heaven's high convex crown, the Pleiads, Hyades with the northern team, and great Orion's more refulgent beam, to which around the axle of the sky the bear revolving points his golden eye. Still shines exalted on the ethereal plain, nor bathes his blazing forehead in the main. 2 cities radiant on the shield appear, the image one of peace and one of war. Here sacred pomp and genial feast delight, and solemn dance and hymeneal rite. Along the street the new-made brides are led, with torches flaming to the nuptial bed, the youthful dancers in a circle bound to the soft flute and cithern's silver sound. Through the fair streets the matrons in a row stand in their porches and enjoy the show. There in the forum swarm a numerous train, the subject of debate, a townsman slain. One pleads the fine discharged, which one denied, and bade the public and laws decide. The witness is produced on either hand, for this or that the partial people stand. The appointed heralds still the noisy bands, and form a ring with scepters in their hands. On seats of stone within the sacred place the reverend elders nodded o'er the case. Alternate, each the attesting scepter took, and rising solemn each his sentence spoke. Two golden talents lay amidst, in sight the prize of him who best adjudged the right. Another part, a prospect differing far, glowed with refulgent arms and horrid war. 2 mighty hosts a leaguered town embrace, and one would pillage, one would burn the place. Meantime the townsmen, armed with silent care, a secret ambush on the foe prepare. Their wives, their children, and the watchful band of trembling parents on the turrets stand. They march by Pallas and by Mars made bold. Gold were the gods, their radiant garments gold, and gold their armor. These the squadron led, august, divine, superior by the head. A place for ambush fit they found, and stood covered with shields beside a silver flood. 2 spies at distant lurk, and watchful seem if sheep or oxen seek the winding stream. Soon the white flocks proceeded o'er the plains, and steers slow moving, and 2 shepherd swains behind them piping on their reeds. They go, nor fear an ambush, nor suspect a foe. In arms the glittering squadron rising round, rush sodden hills of slaughter heap the ground. Whole flocks and herds lie bleeding on the plains, and all amidst them dead the shepherd swains. The bellowing oxen the besiegers hear, they rise, take horse, approach, and meet the war. They fight, they fall beside the silver flood. The waving silvers seem to blush with blood. Their tumult, their contention stood confessed. One reared a dagger at a captive breast. One held a living foe that freshly bled with new-made wounds. Another dragged a dead. Now here, now there, the carcasses they tore, fate stalked amidst them, grim with human gore, and the whole war came out and met the eye, and each bold figure seemed to live or die. And Yao. So that's just about a quarter of the description of what is on Achilles' sword. Quite gnarly. And if we have a time before the half hour, I'm going to read you 4 poems by Hanif Abdurraqib. Remember, African-American poet from the Midwest, called In Defense of That Winter Where I Listened to the First Taking Back Sunday album every day until the snow peeled itself back from the grass and I found my college sweatshirt again. We got kicked out of the only bar that could fit us, and all of the sadness we latched to our backs when Jared swallowed too much of something dark and burning right before he took the microphone from someone singing Beat It during the karaoke night and started to read a poem he found in the ice outside our apartment the morning after the cancer came back and stretched itself wide in his mother's lungs. And all I heard before he got pulled by the collar was something about the slow dying of a town drowning in its own oil. And now we have nowhere to drink ourselves into whatever silence will make the night into a time machine. Instead, I give another new girl my warmest clothes while we stare up at the moon and clutch each other out of the necessity for warmth and never the hunger for romance. She asks if I have ever watched a singer throw his grief over an audience like a blanket, a mass of boys weeping in front row, and I tell her yes, because I have seen a father singing a prayer into his palms while a woman he loves fades away forever, and I think this may be the same thing. I think I may have been among the mass of boys crying in the ruins of a city painted in the cool gray of heartache. Ice is starting to fall from the sky again. It falls into the hair of the girl I am holding, and I run my fingers through it, looking for the end of a poem. She asks if I have ever watched someone take a shovel and chisel the ground until it fits only them and what they can carry in their arms to heaven. And I tell her no, even though I can see Jared sitting in the light from the upstairs window, holding the picture of his mother, where he is small and holding her hands, and crying next to a wooden roller coaster that once stretched high into the Cincinnati sky, but was just torn to dust and replaced with something metal and fast and howling, because the boys stopped being afraid and told themselves they could never die from anything. And I think of this watching Jared in the glow of his younger self and his living mother and the 2 cigarettes he is holding in each hand, drinking the thick black smoke into his lungs and closing his eyes in prayer. And I don't know if it is love that carries us to that kind of drowning. So I ask the girl I am holding if she has ever seen a boy so in love with another person that the boy sews his own burial suit with his bare hands. I'm not even going to attempt to say the title of that poem again, but the title itself is like a poem. Here's another one by Hanif Abdurraqib. And it's called When I Say That Loving Me is Kind of Like Being a Chicago Bulls Fan. And it continues, what I mean is that my father can tell a bunch of cool stories about back in the day when I was truly great. There is a mountain of gold that has gathered dust in the corner where I used to sleep, and look at all these pictures. In one, I am wearing rainbow shorts and hurling rocks at a shoreline. In this one, I am smiling in the glow of 13 lit candles pushed into a sheet of dark sugar. You may ask why I allow my face to drown in less and less joy with each passing year, and I will say, I just woke up one day, and I was still a photo in everyone else's home but my own. Or I will say, I promise that my legs just need another season, and then I will be who you fell in love with again. And then probably just, I'm sorry that there was once a tremendous blue sky, and then a decade of hard, incessant rain. All right, we're going to skip to number 4 because that's what we have time for. It's called On Melting. I am still fascinated by the glint of warm light that echoes off the snow and arrives to throw a small blanket on the uncovered flesh of anyone brave enough to walk through another harsh winter. Even after decades encased in the Midwest during such loveless hours when the streets become covered in white, like everywhere we look is another anchored ghost clawing at the window. But this is a season where I will make the face of a girl on a cookie and pass it to her across a room full of strangers, which is a weird way to say, I think I could love you until even the sun grows tired of coming back every day or every spring to forgive us for another season of hiding. But it is not like me to be brave, at least not until there is enough warmth for the corner to flood again, with the cities melting, until the boys tear their hands from the cold glass and burst fearless again into the wetness. Especially not when I can miss a stranger who may not remember me for months, or fill a notebook with questions I might ask from across a table in the soft buzz of a coffee shop while 2 drinks grow cold. Yet still not as cold as the night we first laughed at the same joke, or at least the first time her laugh drifted across a room and I hungered for better humor. Before I walked home in 3 sweaters and 2 pairs of pants, shivering in the darkness, asking myself how long it would be before I could finally peel back all of those layers and become a new, unbreakable device. So that's the end of the poetry section. We're right at 5:30. Boom. I want to remind you where we were. We took a little break from String Too Short to Be Saved, and we're almost at the end of the book. I was originally going to just read a couple of chapters from this book and then be done with it, but it's very fascinating. And this is not the last chapter, but this is the 3rd from last chapter. And if you'll remember, this chapter began with his grandparents' neighbor, the woman, walking over to the house, and she never walked over to their house, and saying, my husband is dead. And they've moved through a number of things, including the son who was in the service coming home, and instead of making that farmhouse into a real farm, which Hester wanted to do. And remember, Hester is the person who's 8 years older than Donald Hall. And they are in the house where the funeral is happening. And I'm just going to go back to the paragraph I read just before we stopped it. Not that you'll remember, but it gives a little important context about his relationship with Hester. We could still talk about the past, and then she became enthusiastic. She loved me to repeat the stories my grandfather had told me. As for me, it seemed that I enjoyed being away from my grandfather and with someone only 8 years older than I. In the evening, Hester and I might take a walk for an hour. I hayed in the afternoon, but I didn't tag after my grandfather in the morning or stay with the old people in the sitting room at night. Old Home Day that summer came shortly after the funeral. I suppose in its nature Old Home Day is a depressing celebration, but I had never thought so when I was a child. Back in the 30s, they were held in the Methodist campgrounds in the center of a huge grove of pines. Little camps stood like dolls' houses at the feet of the great trees, and the white church and meeting hall loomed in the center. Every summer, my grandfather and I made frequent trips to a wooden shack just outside the grove where huge cones of homemade vanilla ice cream sold for 5 cents. The other feature of Old Home Day that I loved was the Sandbourne Band, whose bright uniforms and thumping bass drum made the best music I had ever heard. We drove to the campgrounds in the morning, carried by Uncle Luther in his antique car, and we ate a picnic on the pine needles at noon while the band gave us a concert. In the afternoon, when Uncle Luther made his annual speech, and sometimes the governor or a senator, I would fall asleep with my head in my grandfather's lap. The hurricane of 1938 blew the pines over, and the great trees crushed the camps, the church, the meeting hall, and the ice cream stand. Soon after, the war took away the young men. The dance in the evening ended, and the play which the young people put on. Old Home Day became a Sunday afternoon in August when old people in the yard of a church, when old people met in the yard of a church, when Old Home Week was established by Governor Rollins in 1899, these old people had been young. It had been another 4th of July, and the married men played single men in baseball. The governor had proclaimed it, however, for a reason which the years made plain. Old Home Week was the time for returning to the place you had left. Even in 1899, the country was emptying. By 1949, most of the survivors of those who had left 50 years before didn't even know they had an old home. The original immigrants were dead or too old to travel. Always there would be a few other children there, so that I would have to have someone to talk to. But mostly the old reminisced with the old. Sometimes a middle-aged woman would appear with some grown children, and the old people would stare at her while she smiled nervously. Suddenly someone would say, "Are you Abel Kuttner's daughter?" And she would say yes and be happy to be recognized. Then she would show off her children, and the old people would look for Abel Kuttner's forehead or long earlobes. People who couldn't leave their houses all winter gathered strength in July for the August Sunday. On that day, the old people's homes emptied. Each year, of course, some were dead who had come the summer before, and I heard many an old voice doubt that it would last out another winter. Hands were shaken at the end with a firmness that feared that these hands would never shake again. I stood with my grandfather while he talked to an old lady with whom he had played on a hayfield 60-odd years before. A man with whom he had wrestled in the summer evenings after work in the hame shop, and a boy who was the grandson of the best friend of his youth, dead for 40 years. That year, Hester and her mother were the center of attention because William had died only 2 weeks before. The old people clucked and recalled the past. No one mentioned William's 20 years of drinking and fecklessness. Hester looked haggard, but nodded her head to all of them. I found Robert Buck, and we leaned against the side of the church and talked. All I really liked to do with him was play catch, but we didn't have a ball, and it was Sunday besides. He talked about cars, and I talked about books, until our families gathered us for the journey home. The day I was going back to Connecticut, I was sitting in the living room quietly when I heard noises from the dining room. My grandmother seemed to be crying, and my grandfather was soothing her. They must have thought I was outside. Then I heard my grandfather say, "Everybody changes. He's grown up now." I felt immediately guilty. I had known for a week, but never faced it, that I was happy to leave this summer as I had never been happy before. I went home and went off to school. Immediately I felt nostalgic for the farm where I could be myself and do what I wanted. I wrote my grandparents a long letter full of my love for them and for the farm. When the answer came, it brought terrible news. Just before she had to return to teaching, Hester forced her mother to visit her sister and locked herself in the house and burned it down around her. Chapter 10, Late Summers. The next summer and the summer after, I worked in Connecticut. I visited the farm for a week between school and job, and again between job and school. While I was there, I joined the life of the farm as quickly as I could put on my country clothes. I fed the chickens, my grandfather's job for the rest of the summer, and hayed with my grandfather. At night, we listened to Gabriel Heater and ate our snacks. Yet everything seemed deliberately nostalgic, like old home day. I wasn't coming to hay for a summer. I was taking a vacation where I had spent summers of the past. My grandfather accepted the change as if he had expected it. My mother before me had grown up and moved to the city. Nearly everyone I knew had a summer job. They made money to spend on Saturday night or to save toward the purchase of an old car. The real reason I stayed in Connecticut was a girl. I was away at school most of the year, and we could see each other only in the summers. We went to parties of couples going steady, and we danced to the music of a portable radio. There were the beach parties and drive-in movies and the long hours parked in the car. The saxophones of roadhouses celebrated our biggest occasions, birthdays, obscure anniversaries, and the unendurable farewells before school. On other nights, we ate with parents and looked at each other without being able to touch, full of desperate love and the bottomless vanity of adolescence. The winter day when I broke with my girl and felt all the anguish of a pain that I was responsible for, I knew that I would spend the next summer on the farm. I would live in quietness with the old, without the deliberate gaiety of the tanned couples at the summer dances. I felt a rush of relief to be rid of Connecticut and the blocks of houses in which I had foreseen my life. Even though I knew that the farm was only for the summer, I took it eagerly. It was the only alternative I knew. After my exams, I spent a week in Connecticut and then took the train to Boston and crossed the city in a taxi and took the Boston to Maine to Potter Place. Ansel, my cousin Edna's husband, met me at the station with my grandmother, and the old sedan chugged the 2 miles to the farm. My grandfather was milking. Ansel beeped the horn, which sounded like the bleat of a sheep, and my grandfather came to the window of the barn, as I had seen him do many times. His ancient cloth cap sat on his head against the mosquitoes, and in the cool of early evening, a light brown sweater was covering his gray work shirt. He unclasped the broad door and came running down the hill to hug me, while my grandmother scolded, "Wesley, the doctor said you shouldn't run." The first time I remember seeing my grandfather was the September I turned 4. My parents had driven north with me from Connecticut to the farm on my father's 2-week vacation. I remember the green roadster from snapshots. My grandfather was not at the house when we drove in the yard, so after we had kissed my grandmother, we drove 100 yards further up the road to seek him. He was calling his cattle. Usually he hiked in the pasture to gather them if they were late to come down for milking, but now he was still weak from pneumonia. He had carried his milking stool, really an old leather chair from which he had removed the arms and legs, onto a bare slope, and he was sitting on it and calling up the mountain, "Kiboosh! Kiboosh!" When he saw us, he picked up the chair and ran down the hill to us for all his weakness, and he lifted me up and kissed me on both cheeks. This time, the 3 of us hugged each other in an enormous embrace, and Ansel drove away in embarrassment. My grandfather, who had already finished his dinner, went back up to the barn to finish milking, while I settled down to a fried Spam and raw onion sandwich. My grandmother sat with me, giggling and clucking to herself, enjoying the idea that I was eating such an absurd and traditional meal. "Would you like to do chickens this summer?" she said. She knew I would, and when I'd eaten a floury cupcake, we walked up the hill to the grain shed and filled the pail. I fed the chickens with the same motions which had occupied my old summers. The June sun was still high, and Kearsarge was nearly luminous in the haze of the late afternoon heat. The cows lowed as my grandfather let them out, and I thought I could hear the distant bleat of a sheep down by the lake. We met my grandfather in the yard as we came back from the chickens. "All done?" I asked. "All done for now," he answered, and put his arm around me. "But when the sun's up again, there'll be more to do. And for you, too. It's good to have a hand again." We sat rocking on the porch without lights because of mosquitoes and talked until it grew dark. Across the lake, we heard taps played from the boys' camp. Then we heard voices coming up the dark road and soon saw two counselors, my age, I suppose, walk past on their way to the jukebox down at Sabine. The man who bought Uncle Luther's house had built cabins and a snack bar. Summer was haying and reading and writing. Letters served for me to talk. And I did not miss the beach parties. The restlessness which I had felt in the racing bike summer was satisfied now. I was 20 years old. I knew what I wanted, and my grandfather's stories seemed as fresh as ever. He was surprised when I asked him to repeat his old poems, and happy. He had remembered some more that I'd never heard, and he spoke them that summer in public at a golden wedding. Clarence and Kate Fowler, distant relatives of ours, danced and kissed and cut a cake, and Wesley spoke his pieces just as he had done at the Lyceum 50 years before. Except that I was older. The summer was like the ones before. We hayed the same fields and lived the same life from coffee in the morning till milk and moxie at night. The flowers were bright in the circular bed outside the kitchen window, behind which Christopher sang as brightly and rarely as he ever did. What was different was my sense that I was returning, and that my return was the choice of one life over another. None of the editors of the Harvard Advocate could imagine me living as I did. Whatever I told them about it was understood as affectation, I'm sure. When they lived in the New England countryside, they were the city people who are wrecking the old free bumpy place, and not the natives. Drinking beer in Cronin's in the winter, they told amusing stories about the hillbillies who were, in effect, my own people. So I was conscious of what I was doing, and sometimes it seemed like a deliberate step backward. But consciousness was good too. When I stood on the top of the hay in the sun, I contrasted it with the office where I'd worn a tie for the past 2 summers. When I drank my milk at 9:30 before bed, I remembered the wretchedness of love in the suburbs. The next summer I meant to spend on the farm, but circumstances allowed me only the month of August there. August was a good time, but it was too brief, and the future was too uncertain. I was graduating from college the next June, and I expected to go to the war in Korea. One Saturday night, late in November, in the middle of a gale which drenched all of New England, my grandfather had a heart attack. I went up the next weekend and found him in bed where he had to remain for many weeks. He was sitting up, and he told me that he felt as kinky as a barn rat. I laughed more than I would have ordinarily, and from then on, in letters and when I saw him, he always used the phrase. Enoch Bunwell stopped continually and offered to do errands. Ansel came to milk the cows. The doctor had told my grandmother that there was no chance he could go on milking them, feeding them, haying, or fencing. The cows had to go. Meantime, they were the farm's boarders, eating up the hay that I'd helped him to haul in August. A few were drying up, ready to calve in early spring, but the new heifers would pasture on another farmer's land. My grandfather felt bad about the cattle and didn't want to talk about them. The chickens and sheep could stay. The country workmen who cut the grass and weeds at the side of the road had made a practice of dumping some of their loads by the sheep barn, and now they guaranteed to leave enough to last the winter. My grandmother could handle the chickens, and the farm could continue to seem to be a farm. I sat beside my grandfather's bed as much as I could. Too much talking, the doctor said, would be bad for him. He was gay and full of stories, but he grew tired after a few minutes. I visited again in the winter, when he would sit in his familiar chair in the sitting room, reading Joe Lincoln and David Harum all day long. "It's like a month of Sundays," he said. I came again in the spring, and when he and I could even walk up the hill to the barn and look at the empty tie-up. For the first time in 150 years, there were no cattle on the farm. The cows I had named as a baby and their great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughters whom I had known last summer were only ghosts among the cobwebs of the old whitewashed, spider-webbed cave. In March, the trucks had come and filled themselves with the cattle, while my grandfather stood by and watched the great beasts stumble up the gangplanks, wagging the udders which his hands had stripped of a lake of milk. There was a silence in the barn, like a ruin. Nothing lived there any more. The old horse had been the last to go, a few weeks after the cows. There was still some hay up in the loft, but it would never be eaten. I wondered if the barn would burn someday, and the hay we had pitched in a distant summer go up with the old timbers. On the wall hung the harnesses of many decades, and the 2 pitchforks which had been ours. We walked down to the house slowly and in silence. Then my grandfather said, "It's still a good barn if they keep the roof on her. The timber's still good." He paused. "If I was to start again, I think I would borrow money and fence ragged with good wire and raise nothing but sheep." A moment later, I realized that he had been thinking, but couldn't say it, because he knew it would never happen, and because he didn't want me to say it wouldn't, of me taking over the farm after him. It had started him thinking of sheep. I sat in the living room while he lay on the sofa and told me stories. Dogs were the curse of the sheep farmer. The state paid you for the sheep a dog killed, but it couldn't pay for the whole damage. Some sheep who hadn't been touched by a dog would fade away and die of the terror. Others would stop bearing. One dog in one afternoon could ruin the work of a decade. Once he remembered that he had heard crazy barking from the meadow where Uncle Luther was keeping his sheep. He got up there as soon as he could, saw a collie dog running mad among the terrified sheep, slashing and running, eating nothing, only wild to kill. He fired one barrel of his shotgun into the air in order not to hit the sheep, then fired the other into the dog as it raced toward him. The dog leapt in the air and ran off to die in a ditch beside the railroad tracks. Then my grandfather started to count the flock. 4 sheep lay dead where he could see them, the flies already black on their torn throats. A 5th lay in a hollow. Then he climbed a hillock to see the bright eyes of a lamb watching him nervously, head held up alert over the crest of the top. He thought, "That one looks so perky, she must be all right." But when he reached her, the flesh of one side had been torn away, and her entrails lay beside her on the ground. He loaded his gun with a shell and fired it into her head. They were able to come to my graduation 6 weeks later, stiff and proud in their new clothes. I drove them back to the farm and said goodbye. A fellowship in Oxford was keeping me from the army, and I was spending the summer in Europe. In October, my grandfather had another heart attack, but the pains subsided again, and in March he was well enough to celebrate their golden wedding. They sent me the photographs, and I looked at them in the dampness of my college rooms almost with strangeness. My grandmother was wearing a printed silk, and my grandfather his brown graduation suit, although he had become almost stout, the first time in 77 years that he had shown any fat. All their surviving neighbors and 3 of their old ministers came for the wedding cake and the speeches. That summer, I returned briefly to the United States to marry the girl I had courted in my last year at college. I spent a week in New Hampshire before the wedding. Another attack in the late spring had left my grandfather quieter, but his talk was as fine as ever. He was excited to think of me marrying, and he joked about my children. Of course, the doctor wouldn't let him go to the wedding, which was in New Jersey. We were sailing to England and Oxford 4 days later, and our honeymoon would be on board ship. We decided to drive to New Hampshire the day after the wedding to show them the bride and to say goodbye. He seemed a little less stiff than he had a month earlier. It had been a good month, he said, and he felt kinky as a barn rat. The summer was always the good time. He had thought so all his life. Obviously, he dreaded the winter ahead. After supper, we talked in the sitting room until 9 o'clock. Then, "Time for bed, Wesley," said my grandmother. He giggled. "Time for your bed, too," he asked my bride and me. "Wesley," said my grandmother. The two old people stood up slowly, and we followed them into the kitchen. The heat of the wood stove felt good in the September night. We had our late snack, and we all went to bed. In the morning, my grandmother brought us coffee in bed, shouting ahead to ask if we wanted it, and we got up and dressed in the cold and scurried down to the warm kitchen. During the day, we introduced the farm to Kirby. We walked to the two barns and showed her the pump of clear, cool water in back of the house. We passed my grandmother's playhouse and looked at the fallen shed and the caving sap house. "I made a lot of syrup 2 years ago," said my grandfather. "It'll last us another year." He paid great attention to Kirby and told her the stories he thought she would like to hear. The day passed quickly. At twilight, after our early supper, my grandfather and I walked outside while the two women washed dishes. He'd been thinking about weddings, and he told me how Washington Woodward, in a youth I could barely imagine, had tied a cowbell under an aunt's bed and rung it every 10 minutes during her whole wedding night. We walked slowly uphill to the barn, which looked like a rocky ledge of ragged in the gray light. When we were nearly to the milk shed, he suddenly pointed upward at the branches of the great maple next to the old outhouse. "Look," he said, "there's a hedgehog." I followed the angle of his finger and saw what resembled a bird's nest at a fork in the branches, indistinct in the late light. "Let's see how you are with a shotgun these days," he said. I lifted the gun from its peg where it hung in the shed nearest the kitchen. My grandfather rummaged to find a bag of shells. He hadn't fired a gun since his first attack. There were 4 shells in the right size shot, and 1 shell which fired a slug which could kill a bear at close range, but was too inaccurate for anything small. I took aim and fired the 4 shells of shot one after the other. The only obvious result was an ache of my shoulder where the kick of the gun bruised it, for though I shivered the branches around the hedgehog, I couldn't make him budge. "He's hit," said my grandfather, "but he won't fall off for you. Hedgehog will stay on a limb until you cut the limb off." He reached for the gun. I had done all the shooting because of his heart, and now he loaded the slug into the breech and raised the gun quickly and fired. I will never forget him raising the gun to fire it straight up in the near darkness, puffing with the unusual effort, 77 years old and sick after a life of hard labor. The hedgehog sprang up in the air, seemed to pause there, and then fell to the ground, turning slowly in the air like a huge leaf. He smiled to see what he had done, and said that he guessed he had his eye still. The next morning we said goodbye after breakfast, all of us weeping, and I never saw him again. That was chapter 10 and a little bit of chapter 9. Thanks for coming to Storytime for Saturday, March 8th, 2025.